Before we get started in this episode, a quick announcement. As you know, I'm very passionate about acceptance and commitment therapy, and I also run a busy practice in Canberra. We're currently looking for psychologists who are registered in Australia to join our team, who are also passionate about learning about ACT. We provide supervision on a group and individual basis and training around ACT. So if this is you, if you're interested, please express your interest at strategicpsychology.com.au/careers. Look forward to hearing from you. And now back to this episode.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking. Yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name is Nesh Nikolic, and my guest today is Dr. James Kirby, who is a senior lecturer and clinical psychologist at the University of Queensland. He has a broad range of research interests in compassion science. However, specific research areas that he enjoys most of his time in is examining compassion-focused therapy, examining compassion with children, what fears, blocks, and resistance people have towards compassion, and developing and evaluating compassion interventions. James also holds a visiting fellowship at the Centre for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at Stanford University, and is an honorary member of the Compassionate Mind Foundation in the United Kingdom. Today, we talk everything compassion-focused therapy, and it's a pleasure of mine because it's so closely related to acceptance and commitment therapy. That is one of my interests. So I know you're going to enjoy this, and I certainly have. The models that Dr. Kirby brings up in our conversation are fantastic and so applicable, and I think you'll find it really enjoyable and a lot to learn from today's conversation. So enjoy. James, a big thank you for coming onto the program today to talk about something that's dear to my heart because it's so close to the acceptance and commitment therapy work that I'm passionate and have a strong love for. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself and our topic today as well.
Oh, thank you very much for having me here, Nesh. It's a real delight. Yeah, definitely there are a lot of parallels between compassion-focused therapy, which is a lot of the work I focus in on, and acceptance and commitment therapy. There's a lot of people actually really pushing a kind of integration of the two as well. People like Dennis Tersh and so on from the US. So my work is kind of focused on compassion-focused therapy and how it kind of is applied clinically to help people. But also I'm interested in sort of the decision-making model to compassionate behavior. So that's just outside of the kind of, I guess, clinical realm, and more in trying to understand, what are some of the costs and benefits we pragmatically weigh up as we choose to be compassionate.
Can you describe for some of our listeners, obviously we've got clinicians who are listening to us and also lay people who enjoy the space of psychology. Can you explain a little bit about what compassion-focused therapy is?
Sure. So compassion-focused therapy was developed by a person called Professor Paul Gilbert, and he developed it back in the probably early 80s. Yet it's had perhaps a slow arc into making its way to Australia. So I think the therapies are still going by ship, even though we've got the internet. So sometimes when Paul hears it's a new therapy, he kind of goes, "No, I've been writing about this since the early 80s," which I, of course, love because it was kind of forming before I was born, so I can always stir him up a little bit with that. But what Paul was really interested in was evolutionary models to understanding mental health. So he did his Ph.D. at the University of Edinburgh, which had a very large evolutionary psych department. And so he was really interested in how these evolutionary models might help us understand things like depression, and that was his major focus. And then in working with that evolutionary model and working with those with depression, he was coming into contact with often with clients, the real difficulty people had with using an inner tone of voice that was warm and compassionate, or kind, if you will. And then that became the real genesis of compassion-focused therapy developing, because he would ask, the clients he was seeing, would they be willing to try speaking in this kind of inner tone, which is kind and friendly? And they would be, no way, not a chance. And so that led to trying to unpack what the worries or concerns would be for them if they were to start to try this kind of alternative way of relating. And then Paul, through the evolutionary model, links that kind of inner relating style, which is warm and compassionate, to physiological systems within the body, which of course links into how our brain kind of will then interact with that physiology, which obviously influences what we kind of tend to think about and feel about. So he's got this kind of big integrative model that tries to link all those processes in, which gives rise to compassion-focused therapy.
Can you talk us through a little bit in terms of how evolutionary models somewhat explain this angst towards being compassionate? Why are we so harsh on ourselves? How is that beneficial, and protective and has been, helpful to date? And obviously, how we look to address those in therapy.
Yeah, there are a range of competing factors that have probably shaped our tendency to adopt, at times, very harsh and self-critical relating styles. And linking it in to Paul's model, he kind of at one of the core components of his model is often referred to in sort of its most simplistic way as the 3-circle model of affect regulation. And really, this is kind of linking emotions into motivations. So he kind of puts forward this theory, which is all called social mentality theory. And part of this theory is this idea that we have these basic social motives that we're trying to enact in order to interact and make sense and get our basic needs met. So there'll be things like avoiding harm, but equally pursuing things that are really important to us. And they could be things like, finding a house, finding a partner, securing food, et cetera, et cetera. But equally, other important process is being able to be in a state of contentment. And so they're kind of referred to as the 3 circles of threat, self-protect, avoiding harm, the drive system, which is about pursuing things that are important, and then which we often call the blue circle, and then a green circle, which is linked into this state of contentment or being at ease and no longer wanting. So those 3 are kind of emotional systems linked into specific motivations. And what Paul kind of postulates is that red circle threat self-protect system is kind of our default operating system. It will always hijack attention because it's much safer for you to be, better safe than sorry is the key principle to that system. And so evolution isn't interested in you being happy. Evolution is interested in, and life is interested in you staying alive. And so this threat system often kicks off very quickly. And there's a lot of studies sort of looking at how bad tends to be more dominant than good in its simplest form. And so we have a tendency to generate towards that. And equally, therefore, when we have internal threats come up within our own mind, or dangers or worries, or something happens in our environment which we weren't wanting, so a disappointment, a failure, a setback, we can relate to ourselves from that kind of threat-based system, which has a lot of anger in it. So emotions kind of hooked up in there are things like anger, anxiety, fear. And so we can kind of relate to ourselves from this system with anger, and that anger directed inwards is often referred to as self-criticism.
It's in some sense, it's much better to see danger where there is none than not see danger where there is some, because you can make that error once, and it could potentially be a fatal error, versus if you make a false positive error and you're not harmed. Well, it's neither here nor there, because you wouldn't have been harmed either way. Having said that, you can be self-critical or in fear, anxious, or even feeling helpless and hopeless, moving forward, ongoing. So it's such a useful model in that we've observed that be the case in evolutionary terms, but with the more mindful and cognitive sort of space where we're really looking to how can we not override, I'm assuming, but more so appreciate the protection motive, because it's got great value and continues to have great value in today's society.
Oh, you're absolutely spot on. So a lot of people will come in and kind of some goals can be to get rid of that kind of threat system because it's been so dominant. Which makes perfect sense. They want to come and it's like, well, what would you like from therapy? And it'd be like, I'd hate to feel I want to get rid of this anxiety. I'm sick of feeling it all of the time. But of course, we can't get rid of it. The idea is it is signaling to us something important, that there's a danger or worry. So there is something there, and it's trying to understand what that is so we can, perhaps as you mentioned, appreciate it more or understand it better, and then also be able to let it know, hey, it's okay, I've got this, or reassure ourselves, whatever it might be, in order to deal with the situation or event that kind of set the alarm off. So the idea is it's there, it's how we work with it, which becomes key. And for some people, the environments in which they're raised can cause that system to become highly sensitive. So, if you're, growing up in a family where there's a lot of unpredictability, and then when there is some kind of mishap, there's some punitive parenting practices, perhaps hitting or yelling or screaming, or it's dangerous. One thing you would like to be doing in that situation is to be highly sensitive to any potential threat or anticipatory danger and try to ensure that you are safe or hidden from that. And then, of course, that then generalizes outside of the family home potentially, because this has been developed over many, many years. So you've got this highly sensitive threat operating system that picks up on this, danger very, very quickly. But then you're in this kind of heightened state constantly, and you don't have this capacity really to have this sense of freedom. Right? This freedom just go out and explore and so on. So, and we also have environments outside of the home which are highly competitive. So when you've got a very highly competitive environment, there's a big emphasis placed on where you are compared to others. And that can often bring in a sense of hyper-monitoring again, social comparison, and then kind of, relating styles, if dominant, with the red circle of I'm a loser, I'm falling behind, I'm not as good as. And then that can be the critical stuff, which can lead to depression and so on. But equally, it can lead to that really heightened anxiety and can be overcompensated with perfectionistic kind of behaviors. So it's a real catch-22. It's terrible.
Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of overlap as well with some of that maybe schema work terminology with the sensitive mode or vulnerable child. Or the protector, and they all have merit and value in keeping us safe, or performing different, obviously, tasks. But also, I'm hearing as well with some of the examples that we often can hear as therapists and from others as well, is those really extreme cases where there is physical violence or abuse and the like, but it's really that competitive side, as well as those other more acute and frightening things that a lot of us are living in on a daily basis. Like the competitive nature is just there all the time, with or without a difficult family life.
That's exactly right. You don't have to have experienced that kind of a family of origin, which is just a tragic experience to have to go through. And adverse childhood experiences are quite common. It's terrible. But equally, you could have had a wonderful family of origin with lots of memories of warmth and safeness and joy, but be in contexts which are very hyper competitive, where whether or not you get a bonus is based on how many sales you make, or and those kinds of key performance indicators over time tend to go up, not down. So it just becomes harder and harder and harder sometimes to break into that. And often we're kind of told from a cultural kind of a perspective that really it's how hard you try, or the amount of input you put into it, that will determine the output. Kind of ties into that kind of pursuit of happiness kind of idea. You just got to keep pushing. That's easy to do to a degree if everything else is taken care of. But if you're juggling competing demands, looking after, say, an elderly parent, or having to hold down a couple of different jobs to pay the rent and so on, it's very hard to pursue the things that are most intrinsically rewarding for you as you're trying to ensure the other people in your life are being cared for. So the push mindset of competitiveness can really chip away at one's mental health and have really disastrous impacts. So compassion-focused therapy tries to shift out of a dominant competitive mindset, and particularly in relation to oneself, and shift into a compassionate motivation.
I'm in so many ways hearing just being human means that you are part of this space, and that if you're fortunate enough, if I can use that terminology, to have parents who, I don't know, let's just use some stereotypes. Mum is a lawyer and dad's a doctor. The context in relational frames, that is good. Doctor is good, lawyer is good, right? And other vocations are bad, that are lower in a comparison because of how much money they bring home. But in an environment where we apply good and bad, there creates a space of just being born into a family can have pressure in it, even if mum and dad are very supportive and encouraging of a child's journey. Nonetheless, the mind will go out and play those tricks and say, how do I maintain greatest level of survival? And that's potentially I need to maintain mum and dad's approval, and the only way to do that is to beat them, or achieve their level that I think they want me to aspire to, and hence that harshness. Can you talk me through? And I hope I got that. I hope I got that okay in your mind as well. Can you talk us a little bit about the resistance that people have towards this odd concept of being kind and compassionate and understanding of oneself?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Paul, as he was starting using this kind of compassion focus, and I think that's probably a good point to make too. Paul deliberately called it compassion focus because the idea is we're going to be using scientifically supported interventions, but we tried to do them perhaps with this compassionate motivation being the kind of key driver to how we engage with that process. So it might be exposure, for example. We would definitely be doing exposure, but as we do exposure, we might be orienting it in a compassion focused way. The same with mindfulness and so on. So all of those core practices, which we see, across therapies, are with, if they're supported and the science is indicating this is actually a really key ingredient of change, that'll be part of the compassion-focused therapy approach.
James, if I could just jump in, can you talk us through how that would look different when you orientate from a compassion perspective? Let's just use exposure as the intervention. How does exposure with compassion look different, or what are the added elements that you would bring to the table for clients?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the first things therefore then is as you're connecting with the client, and working with them through that initial kind of connecting, therapeutic rapport building, and so on. If we're going to use this compassion focused approach, part of that will be psychoeducative. So talking about, the fear and how they can be associated and how that's not their fault. They didn't choose to feel fear. And so it's just part of the design of being human. It's just built in. And so part of that is trying to create a kind of a de-shaming experience for the client around the origins of whatever the fear or phobia might be, if it's the case of the exposure. And so part of that is to try to help the person not feel ashamed about, having to seek therapy for this, or that there's something wrong with them for having perhaps this really intense fear. So part of that is, hey, no one chooses to have this. Humans, this is what goes on. This is part of the human experience. And of course, that's not your fault. So then the next part then is then moving into, okay, well, one of the ways that we could help with this is through this process of, exposure is an interesting word, isn't it? I don't mind the term exposure, but I was hearing people talk about different ways to, refer to that process of exposure. And I heard someone say, well, with kids, I've forgotten the person's name, with kids, they like to use courage quests. I just thought that sounded like a way cooler name for exposure, a courage quest. Sounded like an adventure, something fun, something I would like to do. Whereas if I was in therapy and a therapist said to me, oh, we're going to do exposure, I'd be like, hang on, what the heck? What is exposure? Could you exposing feels like you've got this nakedness or vulnerability. Whereas a courage quest sounds like I'm Indiana Jones.
And it also creates intent. It creates, what am I potentially going to need to bring forward into this space? Why am I doing this? And it's in many ways that it is a quest where we're trying to find out and be curious about what happens. I think adults can benefit just as much as kids with that type of language, because we are all language bound and entangled beings. I love that. I'll be stealing that one for sure. So thank your colleague, whoever it was.
It was something on Twitter I saw, and there were all these different names being thrown around, and that one just really resonated with me. And I suspect, with many others, but there's probably other wonderful ways we could call this kind of process of learning, different ways we connect with whatever that stimuli or thing is that we're scared of. But then the next part then is, after going through all of that, we might kind of create a compassionate mind as we go into that. And so a kind of compassionate mind requires a number of different things, but the general principle is trying to ground our bodies and kind of bring to mind this kind of compassionate mind that kind of has the core characteristics of wisdom. And the wisdom part is this idea that, it's not your fault that we're experiencing this, yet you're trying to look at ways to be helpful for yourself. Then a strength part, and that's that strength that comes from the grounding of the body and the body posture work we might do. And then the committed part, which is, I'm going to try to engage with what is difficult to help bring about a life of meaning for me. So we kind of imagine what it would be like to have, an orientation to life shaped by those three qualities. And we kind of build that a little bit and then bring this compassionate mind into the exposure. And so the idea there being then, as you're going through the exposure, if that exposure hasn't gone, you're kind of going through and you're working through it. If then after the process, a person reflects on their exposure and their self-relating style is still textured highly by self-criticism, there can be this kind of judgmental kind of language. Oh, look, you only did 40% of your hierarchy. That's rubbish. What's wrong with you? Another person would be higher up. I bet the therapist thinks you're weak. this kind of stuff can go on if you haven't addressed potentially that inner relating style as they go to do tasks that do have kind of outcomes associated with them. Whereas what we would hope is with this compassionate mind, you'd go through that. And if it didn't go well, be able to validate the pain that's gone with that, but also to be able to then, look at encouraging you and noticing and reminding you, hey, look at what you've done, look at what you were able to do, and then encourage to try again. Maybe not immediately, but encouraging again to commit, if you will, to the action.
In many ways, I'm hearing that there's almost like a parenting style or approach that comes from seeing that part inside you, and or maybe not in parenting. A relationship is a better language, I think. There's an understanding or an observation of there being a part of you, and how can someone relate to those parts? Whether it is the critical part, which might actually be the protector, that's kind of saying, hurry up, move on, you're going to be left behind. You're pathetic. Everyone else is better and faster, and your therapist is wasting their time on you. Yes. Whatever it might be that is kind of bringing that forward is, in some sense, how do we relate to that, see that, and then also, I suppose, unpack that to look at the modality that it's coming from, or the intent, and relating to it, as you say, I think from a place of wisdom and strength, and maybe even a commitment to learn from that rather than to achieve something.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's amazing because, and this kind of ties into your earlier questions around the fears and resistances. As we start to bring that in, fears and resistance pop up immediately. Things like, won't compassion. If I was self-compassionate, won't that just mean I drop my standards? I won't be motivated. I won't push myself hard enough. So these kinds of things can come up. But equally, if you were to use a different example and ask them, if this was someone really close to you, like a friend who you cared about, who was going through this same process of using the exposure example and was trying to do it, and then had an experience which didn't go so well and they were upset, what would you say to them? Or how would you feel towards them? And almost immediately they'll say things like, oh my God, you did so well there. I mean, this is so difficult. I can see how stressed out you are, yet there you are trying. This is just fantastic. And you're like, okay, so that's what you've offered them. That's fantastic. How do you feel about doing that towards yourself? And they're like, oh, no way in the world. And it's kind of like, well, what makes you want to say that to them? Oh, I'm just trying to help them. And so it's like, how do you feel about offering yourself that same kind of, oh, no. So, there's already, they know the wisdom of how to help someone else, to encourage them. My son's 6.5, and whenever he tries something new, and recently he's been really pushing the boundaries with his bike riding. When he falls off, like, I'm not yelling at him and screaming at him, telling him he's failed and he's an idiot. You get close, right? You get close. Hey, you okay? You check him out. You change your tone of voice subtly. And all of these subtle changes in closeness, eye contact, gentleness of voice, these are all trying to not only make the other person feel safe, but also encourage them to try again at something they've just learnt is dangerous, right? To get back on and have another go. And so you might gentle it a little bit, but then you pick up the energy and you're like, you were doing great. I reckon you can go again, and then off they go. And the idea is, compassion's wanting to encourage you to have a go, but it's trying to do it in a way which is helpful, as opposed to demeaning or making you feel like you're lousy. So a lot of people really identify or really strongly rely on this kind of fear-based drive. And what we're kind of suggesting, which is a lot of the competition aspect, but what we're kind of suggesting, there is another way which we think long-term will be more helpful and encouraging to help you flourish. And that's more from a green-based drive for what you're striving for. However, still knowing things are dangerous, and that's why you're doing it with a therapist together in a collaborative manner, because it is something that really is still bringing up a lot of pain.
It's interesting because we often, and our education system is in many ways set up this way, that the fact that we do grading says something. There's inadvertent messages going on, rather than asking students to complete tasks and still giving feedback. The fact that there's a grade attached to it immediately goes out and sets up a different space. I remember actually doing our masters some time ago now, and there was I think it was one semester that the school changed the approach, and they said, we're not grading, it's going to be pass fail. The cohesiveness that came about in terms of the group, we immediately established a study group. So we all got together and we'd sit around and we'd round table, all these case conceptualized sort of, studies that we needed to do, and sharing all of our resources, and everyone was kind of bringing each other up and so on and so forth. It was absolutely beautiful to watch. And it was a stark difference to the competition-based one, and sadly it returned back. I don't know what they're doing today, but it did return back. And I remember all of us scratching our heads, going, we learned so much that semester, and our competence must have gone up, because we were so much more engaged. We were no longer under threat and trying to study. We're actually being encouraged and enjoying it much more. And that's what we're kind of, I suppose that's what you're saying here is, even whether it's learning a skill or, about yourself, it doesn't require cracking the whip. It doesn't have to be a competition-based space. It can be, one from support, kindness, compassion, curiosity, and, the research backs that and says that there's really good, long-term outcomes. And I'm assuming long-term is the key here, because I'm pretty sure we could go and crack the whip and get people to perform super high. But there's a difference between outward performance in terms of, how many widgets did you make versus how do you relate internally? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the example you gave just before was fantastic about how these external levers can be pulled, and it can immediately shift how we start to see others and support each other. And so if you've got that kind of safe and encouraging environment given to you, one of the automatic things you'll start to see is cooperation and connectedness just start to flow out, which is obviously what we're trying to do somewhat internally for clients as well. Sometimes it's trying to work out where these rules come from, how long have these rules been around, and often in CFT it's a case of the rules there, so I'm not a failure, but it as Paul would kind of comment on. Fear of failure is kind of like a mid-level fear in CFT. So it kind of goes down a deeper level again. So what would be the fear of failing? What would be the worry there? And then the worry behind that is typically connected to this idea of, well, people don't want to be around someone who's a failure. So there's this sense of underlying fear of I'll be disconnected from others and people won't want to be with me. Which is kind of, a core fear for many. But that idea
that's that rejection evolutionary model that, if I'm rejected, I'm alone, and therefore, I can be attacked. I don't have anyone to support me.
Oh, absolutely. So like a lone monkey is a dead monkey. Humans are hypersocial. We need people from the moment we're born to the moment we leave the world. And the idea of nomadic tribes and movement, and it's dark at night. If you were to be lost, you would hope someone would remember and not forget you and come looking for you, because otherwise it could be, very dangerous and dire situation indeed. So the idea of not being connected is a core fear particularly for mammals and humans. And the idea then is, in school contexts or super competitive environments, making mistakes is almost stigmatized. You can't make a mistake. And you see this in the class environment all the time. Like, I'm a lecturer at UQ, and our courses in the postgrad still have grades attached, but a lot of the work is competency based, where you're getting them to practice skills and with each other. But there's this great fear of going into practicing those skills in front of each other, out of the fear of, what if I make a mistake? You'll think I'm not a good therapist, or you'll question why I got let into the program.
I'll be exposed.
Exposed, that's right. Perfect. I remember experiencing that myself, going through that process as well, of, who's watching me do this, or who am I paired with, or is the teacher around watching me? But the idea is kind of, often when someone picks up on a mistake, and we're judged on the mistake, we're kind of disconnected from what they were trying to do and the process. And often the kind of history they've got with making mistakes is, you just got to try harder, which ties into the more you do, and it's not very clear. What do you mean harder? And so on. Whereas really, you want people to have this kind of freedom to bounce around when learning these things, giving them an opportunity to play with these concepts and strategies we're giving, so that they can start to understand how they function and play out. In artificial intelligence designs, they've tested whether or not, if we pre-program them before putting them in with rules, versus don't give them any rule programming and let them just play and just make mistakes, and then let them into the system, what AI programming works best. And the ones where they just let them play and learn out all the dynamics themselves is more successful once integrated into systems. And I sometimes feel like we lose that as humans a lot of the time. Like, just even as a parent, like, we can be so critical of ourselves, of getting it right constantly. And it's like we lose that playfulness that comes with being a parent and connecting with the kids, knowing that we don't have to have the right answer to how we parent, every second of every day, because they'll just burn you out.
Mm-hmm. I love that question about how long has that rule been around? Because it really brings that back to most people are going to talk about their childhood. Yeah. They're going to realize that it happened very early, and it creates that conversation of a functional analysis around how did that come about? Why did that come about? What was it trying to achieve at that point in time? And really, how was it reinforced and therefore adopted? Because it ended up being the ruling, rule. And so we tend to live by that. I love that particular sort of phrasing and questions. I think it really unpacks so much for clients. It starts a very curious thought or line of thought, and I suppose that place of curiosity also is fairly compassionate. And I'm getting that even from talking to you, that so much of this, whether it's about parenting, it's not trying to place a certain outcome, but rather how can you be toward that? So whether it's us as clinicians, how can I be with my clients, or potentially even how I can be with myself in session, and obviously for the client about how they can be with their rules, thoughts, beliefs, fears, judgments, etc.
Exactly. What you've just kind of summarized there is exactly what we're kind of after from a kind of a compassion focused kind of lens. Is starting to recognize that we can take so much responsibility for so much that has happened to us that it is actually not really things you had control over. Like, you didn't ask to be born. There's a lot of birth lottery involved. You weren't asked to be born at this point of time, in this particular region, and with all of this stuff going on. Yet we can take a lot of ownership for where we find ourselves in a certain context. And so that de-shaming part that Paul really tries to emphasize and hit at any given moment is crucial to try to shift the person into a more playful orientation. It doesn't mean that they're seeing their distress in a dismissive way, not at all. But the idea is, if you can start to de-shame the person, you're kind of moving them out of a mindset which is really textured by competitiveness, where I am seen as either inferior or superior, rather more into a compassionate reassuring, where mistakes are just part of the journey and we can't stop those things from happening. But wouldn't it be great if you were less scared of when they did happen, because you were able to support yourself in a way that was able to validate you and encourage you to continue to pursue or pivot or do whatever it is that allows you to live a life of meaning. And so drawing on a lot of attachment theory is kind of critical to Paul. So which is, of course, an evolutionary model. So, part of it is trying to create within the person their own inner safe haven, so they can calm them and help compose themselves and ground themselves when, the thing hits the fan. And at the same time, give them this secure base so that they can take on something which they know is challenging, a bit scary, a bit of a risk. But it's something that they want to explore and go for. And so they've got a freedom or, an opportunity to feel safeness. And what we mean by safeness is you've got that kind of sense that I can go out and explore, knowing that if it does not go well, you can come back as that internal safe haven. Or if you can't do that necessarily yourself, you've got people around you are willing to turn to, as opposed to what many of us tend to do is kind of, bottle up, mask and hide.
Is that de-shaming process more of the upfront, the earlier stages in compassion-focused therapy? From a place of, you're not responsible for all of these aspects. You might be responsible for some of your actions, certainly, but that also still needs to be considered within context and also, within the environment and obviously depending on age and so on and so forth. But all the other things around you, are completely out of your control, and that includes, automatic thoughts. That there is this ongoing stream of thoughts that is going to be critical. Maybe it was said from somewhere, or maybe it was built into the system through language, competition, and the like. But that we're trying to not be beholden to being responsible for how everything has turned out, or even who we are as human beings, or what's happened to us. Sometimes we can. Clients can feel that, what has occurred to them is, because of them.
Yeah. Well, exactly. That process of what we find is when you go through that de-shaming, the client's energy really picks up about trying to recognize, and I want to try something different, or I want to do something that make amends or repairs. There is an immediate responsibility almost picked up straight after they've been de-shamed. Whereas if you shame someone, often what happens is the person becomes defensive or justifies what it is that they did. Yes, but, this was going on or something like that. Or they'll try to humiliate the person back. Oh, yeah, but you're just in your early days as a therapist, aren't you? If you were to inadvertently shame your client, you might get that response back. So the idea is once we get through that kind of, trying to, wherever we can, help the client feel de-shamed with their experience, it's typically what follows is an immediate kind of, desire to, well, I want it to change. And that's language around responsibility taking. I mean, we sometimes use examples, simple ones like, if you come back and you to a car park and you park your car and it's been hit by someone, it's not your fault that it's been hit. You parked it in the lines and everything like that. But sure, it's still your responsibility to, get the car out of there, get it repaired, do whatever it needs to be done for you to get it home. So, there are many things that happen in life that definitely not our fault, but we still take responsibility for. And we sometimes joke around this issue in therapy groups. So we might say something like, we take responsibility for hygiene and spend a lot of time even practicing and with kids developing the skills of toilet training, etc. It's no one's fault that they have to do these things. Like go to the toilet. Just because you have to go to the toilet doesn't mean you're a bad person. It's just part of what we do. And it's about, learning how to work with it in a way which is, going to be okay and not cause harm. And it's the same with these other parts of our human experience, such as our mind. So how do we work with our mind? And tragically, a lot of people, as you know, Nesh, come to therapy not knowing a lot about how their mind works. And again, not because it's their fault, because it's just not part of the curriculum. It's just, the idea is I should be able to shut off my mind when I want to. And of course, it just doesn't work like that. And, that's not the fault of the clients. It's just tragically, me, myself coming into psychology, I wasn't aware, that this was how the mind works. So unless you're in our field and in our space, often this kind of understanding of how the mind works and how the mind works when it's around other minds is just not common knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Just picking up from what you said, and I'm hoping I get this right, and I'm not by any means suggesting that this is how therapy works, but in some sense, there can be times where if we nurture the red circle, the protector space, there becomes an impetus of saying, well, if I don't have to necessarily put all of my efforts into suppressing this, holding this down, taking responsibility for these things, it kind of deshackles me from that to a degree, and it starts moving into the blue zone.
Yeah.
Of saying, what can I do? How can I drive some of this forward and some of my values,
Sure.
Also appreciating what and some of the drivers of the protector were and so on. And I'm hope I'm capturing this, somewhat okay. Where does the contentment, it's the green, that's the green circle, right?
Yeah, no, spot on. No, and you're capturing that great. I mean, part of it is if you're constantly, and I think this is similar to ACT, like if you're constantly monitoring sort of symptom reduction, it's not really letting you have an orientation of where you're wanting to go. It's like that classic, if you're just monitoring, am I asleep yet? Am I asleep yet? Am I asleep yet? That just keeps you aroused and you don't go to sleep. So what we're wanting is, okay, yes, these things are here and they're unpleasant. Totally get that. And we would like to see these not to be as intense or as strong for you as frequently as they are. One way of working with that is trying to, what we would say is get into this kind of compassionate mind and start to think about what it is that you would like to be doing, how it is that you'd like to be interacting or talking with others, how you'd like to be feeling towards yourself, etc. And then starting to work along that framework. The green circle it kind of helps with that. And so we've got the threat system and the drive system. And these two systems are very activating systems, very doing-based systems. And this links into your body's physiological infrastructure, particularly into the sympathetic nervous system of the autonomic nervous system. And so it has that energy to move and to act. And obviously that's critical. And often for some people, say depression, that drive energy is completely gone. So a lot of work would be done trying to get them going again, and things like behavior activation and things like that, are part of that process, trying to get the actions occurring again. The third circle is the contentment or safeness circle, and we often call it green. Now, green and blue circles, the drive circle, they're both positive, right? So the drive, there's some great positivity in there, feelings like happiness, joy, excitement, etc., when things are going well. But it's high energy, positive affect. Whereas the green circle, still positive affect, but it's low energy. So, feelings of a sense of calmness or contentment or peacefulness. And that system's physiologically linked in to the parasympathetic system. And so these two systems play out within your body through the vagus nerve, and ideally the parasympathetic, well, not ideally, just the way it works, it applies almost opposing force on those organs compared to the sympathetic system. So the sympathetic system gets your heart rate going. Without a parasympathetic system, it'd be like 160, 80 beats a minute. The parasympathetic system acts as a brake to slow it down. So it's more in that range of, 55, 70 beats per minute. Likewise, for metabolism, you're sympathetically driven. You're not metabolizing your food because the energy is used for the actions. Whereas if you're parasympathetically driven, you start to shift into a rest and digest state, and you start to metabolize, because energy can be used that way because you're not trying to do anything. And so often we'll ask clients, okay, here are your three circles. Could you draw for us on the board or on the sheet of paper the size of your circles with how much time you spend in them? So the more time you spend in it, the bigger it would be. And you often find very large red circles, sometimes a moderately sized blue, but the green circle is like a little dot over in the corner. And you'll kind of ask, okay, well, why is it in the corner? And they're like, well, firstly, I don't really know what to do to get contentment unless I ran away from my dependents and was on a deserted island or something like that. Secondly, I just don't even feel like I can get there. It's just too far away. So part of the early, and what we would sort of say is that kind of configuration is more linked to a kind of competitive motivation of, there's all this kind of badness in the red, and I'm trying to overcome the badness by focusing on my blue, by pushing myself, working myself hard. Whereas a compassionate motivation, those three circles are still absolutely critical, but there's just a greater balance between them. So the early stages, we tried to develop the green circle more. And initially with the green circle, what we'll do is sort of body posture exercises, facial expression, inner tone of voice, little things like that. Then you might bring in some soothing rhythm breathing or mindfulness practices and so on, in order to develop the green so that it can be used as a system that can help regulate threat and drive when they come on. It's not in the distance.
I really love that distinction between low energy and high energy activities, because I can definitely go out and see the different personalities that come into our rooms, and obviously, also self-reflecting and looking at, where am I, where am I, filled up, and where do I spend a lot of time in, and I could definitely go out and tell you what it looked like when I was, 18, or when I was, 32, or, where I am today. And they'd be all vastly different in actual fact. Looking at very, very different spaces if we took an average of those. But I love that from seeing how one is very active and the other one is as contentment is, it's very much a cognitive thing. It's about, being comfortable, which is something that we have to untangle for ourselves and come to terms with, and actually begin to enjoy, to learn how to do it. Like most of us try and be content through blue rather than actually developing green, or being in the green. But that's a good start. But we can even push how hard can I meditate, or
completely. I mean, they're just fantastic points you make. Sometimes, clients after a while will just intuitively just say, I'm recognizing that I'm really, blue circling my green. So when I'm trying to get my groundedness, I'm just like going, do it, like with this intensity, which brings up some threat because I'm worried about if I'm doing it right or not. And also they'll kind of blend the circles sometimes. They'll kind of draw it and the blues overlapping the red. And it's like, absolutely. So they can see how these things interact. And it's really important that, we're not suggesting in CFT that we want a perfect balance in every setting, right? So the idea is you want this kind of configuration to be congruent with the setting that you're in as best it can be. So it kind of can be flexible, I suppose, and adaptable in those settings. You don't want to do something that has some urgency, and some high stakes to it. Say, for example, neurosurgery in this kind of really relaxed, kind of contented way, because then, you can miss things, right? But equally, if you're just too focused on the threat, you might get a bit anxious and get a hand wobble or start to panic a little bit. So the idea is you want these to support themselves, but in certain contexts, one system might be slightly more dominant than another. And these can be triggered off by external factors too. So you could go into work feeling, big blue, moderate green, and low red. And then all of a sudden your boss, who is kind of very toxic, kind of greets you at the door and say, where's the report? And that immediately shifts that three-circle orientation. So it's very intrapersonal, and we can do things to regulate it, but it's also interpersonal as well. And of course, contextual when you take into consideration just the class environment that you had before you talked about. Immediately, no grades, blue and green connectedness, but you throw the grades back in, it's more blue-red kind of, competing.
I love that psychological flexibility in that space in terms of it's not trying to achieve one over another, but rather it's contextual based. It's functionally, analyzed as to what's going to give me benefit. And obviously in a genuine threat situation, which there is very few,
Sure.
At least for most of us, and that's not taking away from others that might be finding themselves, in domestic violence or something like that on a regular basis. But in a genuinely threat space, you will be predominantly red, in the red zone. Having said that, it's still very useful to have a little bit of green to potentially, understand what are my choices, here, so that I'm not being too impulsive, depending on the context. I really love that. And obviously, if the boss says, where's my report? So often the red could get inflamed, and if it, or even the blue, like I'll go into action mode and I'll get them back on my side.
Exactly.
Maybe some green can help there as well. I love that it's very visual. It's very adaptable and easy to adopt from a client's perspective to talk in these, three circles. To therefore obviously observe themselves going through life, and decide on what's the balance I need in this particular moment. That we're not striving for a particular arrangement, but rather what arrangement will help me right now.
Exactly. And so a client intuitively gets that, and it brings in this dynamic aspect of, externalizing, drawing, moving around, this kind of stuff, which makes it fun, but also de-shames, because it's kind of like, sometimes clients can come in and can have real difficulty with their emotional language. Sometimes the extent in which you get for some is good and bad. Not all of the kind of granular nuance in, irritation, frustration, anger, rage, they're just all bad kind of thing. And so it immediately gives a language as well around red, blue, green, and you get so much more from it in terms of understanding where they are and what their functions were at that point when you talk about a red circle, because, okay, there was some danger around, they were feeling threatened. And then you can kind of work around that space in terms of, what was going on in the body for the client to start to build their sense of, well, was it more of a situation where I wanted to run away, which is more of my anxiety, or was it more of I was noticing I was defending myself and fighting back? And so you can kind of get more into the anger part, perhaps. But it just frees it up a little bit. And that's really cool with the teenagers as well. And so one of my PhD students, Dylan Maloney-Gibb, he's looking at using this kind of 3-circle orientation to accessing how teens are feeling. And so they just have their phone and they just use their fingers and their thumb and, make it big or make it small, as opposed to reading the survey item around, don't spend too much time thinking about this, just go with your gut instinct. When it comes to living your day on a daily basis, on a scale of 1 to 7, not at all, to 7 extremely, which is kind of verbose. There's a lot in there. Whereas just looking at it, sure, you have to do a little bit of initial explaining, but once you've done it, bang, it kind of sticks. And then a lot of the rationale as to the different exercises you might do are just immediately obvious. So there's a kind of empowering for the client as well.
I love that idea of, expanding or contracting with a circle, that visual. We're so used to doing things like that on our phones and the like, versus and I never know, is it lick it or like it?
Yeah, that's a good point. I won't say like it, but certainly both.
Yeah, I mean, it always feels, a bit nonsense, and I think, not nonsense. My apologies. It feels a bit laborious versus going out and saying this is how it feels. Like it feels this size. I think, obviously an algorithm can quite comfortably say, okay, well, that's a 5 out of the 7 that we allow for,
yes,
versus actually hitting a 5. I think you'd get much better results than that whole problem of, yes to everything, maximum to everything, versus going out and saying, well, yeah, this one's a little bit different to this one. I think maybe how we evaluate and assess things, with something like that in mind. I'm thinking, beyond compassion focused therapy as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could be a good way to, to apply, in research moving forward.
Oh, absolutely. And that's exactly what we're kind of interested in as well, is also not only, because it's got so much application capacity. It's kind of like, not only can you think about it and how I am relating to my client. Am I blue driven because I got to get through 10 clients, or I got to make sure that they're getting the outcomes that they want, for example. But also, what's the room space like too? Like, is there anything I can do to shape the room differently, to shift it away from, say, a threat-based kind of me behind a desk talking to a client versus in the same kind of chairs even. One could be bigger, one could be smaller. All of these little subtle things can shift how the room feels, which means like a teacher in a classroom can get a sense of what's the temperature like in the room. Is it more threat kind of temperature, or is there something I can do to make it a greener temperature, to create that sense of safeness amongst the kids?
It's beautiful to hear you talk in that way, because I've spent so much time, and at least in my mind, about developing the practice that I work in, from the perspective of how we set up an environment that actually considers these things, and not in terms of, oh yeah, we use this color scheme. It's like, no, at every level. Like the fact that we've got these type of curtains that are a bit more wavy, and the fact that we might have shutters that come down or draw down to reduce the temperature, or the lighting, that they're all on a dimmer switch, and so on and so forth, like to the nth degree, because it means, I believe, that it adds, every little bit counts, and that's, I mean, we definitely know that as parents, and as humans, in actual fact. So
you're about trying to create a safe environment. I remember reading a really powerful cross-cultural psychology book. I've forgotten the name of it. I can't believe the author escapes me, but they talked about post the Rwandan genocide, the Americans sent a whole host of mental health professionals to help, everyone process through the intense trauma experienced through that genocide. So many people died and family members died and some terrible things were being done, right? So trying to help with the post-genocide experience, they sent all these psychologists to help. And it got to a point where the head of health for the Rwandan government pulled aside the American contingency and just kind of said, we don't need your help anymore. We have to send you back home. And they're like, why is that? And they're like, well, you're making things worse. You're taking people into these rooms with nothing on them and they can't see outside and it's fluorescent lit room kind of thing. Whereas what we do when we talk about things, we sit outside with other people and often they'll be singing or something like that in order to process difficulty or pains in the past. What you're doing is completely different to how what we would process, pain, hurt on that kind of, scale of tragedy. And it's kind of like we can be so quick to impose kind of this is how we do things, forgetting perhaps the context of where the person's come from, and how we can make some subtle variations in our environment in order to make them feel safer. And in a room which has no windows, no greenery, no nothing, it's not a particularly pleasant. It reminds me of the TV show Severance. You go into Severance, they've got an inner and outer world, and in this inner world, it's just all sterile and white.
It's almost like from even from an evolutionary perspective, talking about that culture, with the Rwandan example, having something that is that, clinical and stark, that's going to create a very large red circle. And then it's like, let's try and process through this. Well, that's actually going to be awful. It's actually counterproductive and can make things worse, just from that perspective. So,
which is what was happening for them. And so, it's so true. I remember talking to one cross-cultural psychologist, and in therapy, she was saying that, often speaking in a second language can be useful because it can provide this kind of, in therapy, it can provide a little bit of distance. They can speak perhaps more openly about the difficulty because it's no longer enmeshed in, say, cultural tradition, perhaps. And so there's a freedom that can become speaking in English in therapy. However, at the same time, it also comes with a huge drawback because there are times where they can't fully describe what it is that they're feeling and what's going on, and it'll be on their tip of their tongue. And she says, I just tell them at those moments, say it as if you were speaking in your mother language. So use your mother language and just say it aloud what it is you're experiencing. She goes, the way they then express it, you can pick up through all of the nonverbals what it is that they're feeling and meaning, and so much more comes out. And you've given space for them to be able to do that. And so it's that kind of recognition of seeing it again in them and giving them an opportunity, inviting them to express it in that way, in a safe environment, and then allowing them to go, how are you feeling now, or what happened then? And she says often those moments are very emotionally powerful.
Absolutely powerful stuff. James, I'm mindful that you've also got a book that you have written, because I'd love to, learn more, and I'm sure there's a lot of others, listening to this as well who'd like to find out more. Can you tell us a little bit about the book, how it came about? It's Choose Compassion, why it matters and how it works. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about, your book, what you cover, and also, where we can go out and find it, to find out more.
Oh, no, thanks, Nesh. Yeah, I started writing this book just prior to COVID. So the publishers contacted me and said, would I be interested in writing a book about compassion? And I sat down and had a cup of coffee, and got excited by the idea, big blue circle, and went, okay, let's do it. And then a week later, COVID hit us, and it's taken about 2.5 years during that process to write it. I just have to thank my wife, because I'd be underneath the stairs trying to chip away at this in the evenings, and she had her hands full with the kids, and I'm just red circle trying to pump out words. But the book itself tries to first kind of unpack what we mean by compassion, like what is compassion, and we kind of define it as a sensitivity to suffering in yourself, but also in others. And then with a commitment to try as best we can to alleviate or prevent the suffering. So then I kind of unpack, where this kind of, construct came from, because it's kind of on the surface simple, but gets complex very quickly. We're compassionate to some, but not others. A big fear, which you kind of mentioned earlier, is if I'm compassionate to these others, I'll lose a whole bunch of my resources. Right. And if we give this group all of these resources, well, then I don't have it and I might need it because I'm going to fall on hard times at some point, perhaps. So these can be fears and blockers to compassionate behaviors amongst people and amongst groups. So I kind of unpack that kind of stuff, but then go into how compassion kind of develops within the family, and how those experiences in family can act as either great promoters of compassion, but equally can create people to start to see compassionate in a fear kind of oriented way. They can start to become scared of it for very valid reasons. And then sort of talk about compassion programs and how they can help cultivate compassion, and how people can have difficulties with self-compassion. And that kind of takes up the first kind of half to 2/3 of the book. And then I start to look at compassion across cultures and how compassion can collapse pretty quickly. It's interesting. We can have great compassion for one person who is suffering, but as soon as that number increases to 2, our level of compassion drops a little bit. So the greater the number, it's almost paradoxical. The greater the number of suffering, the lesser our compassion becomes. And there's a couple of theories as to why that's the case. One big one is this term called pseudo-inefficacy, which is referring to this idea that, well, with one person, I've got a sense of efficacy of being helpful. But if it's 2, I can't be as helpful to 2 people as I can 1. And because of that kind of discrepancy, my compassion towards the 2 has dropped. And then, of course, if you scale that up to millions, what could I possibly do to help?
That jumped to mind, at least from a logical perspective, immediately. That when you've got 1, you could do something about that, and I can be very action orientated, jump into the blue, as where if it's quite large, it can be daunting, and what can I achieve? And paradoxically, here we are in a world where we're actually trying to do more of that, but that's maybe because we are safer. The fact that now, because my children are safe and they're well, and I don't have to worry about the individual, I can now actually look at the group, more and more. But I'm sure if I lived in even Rwanda today, or Sierra Leone, or where it might be, in those many different countries in the world, I think I'd be very still focused on that. The one, it'd be much harder to be looking at my wider community.
Yeah, no, it gets complicated very, very quickly. And that's no one's fault. It's just, it's so tricky. And so you can get the book online, or it's in all good bookshops as well. So you can go check it out there if you'd want to get a hard copy from a shop. But if you just typed in Choose Compassion on Google, but I can also send you a link, Nesh, and as well.
We'll definitely make sure that we put it as part of the blurb in on our web page as well. Online, where can you get that online?
I'm so sorry, Nesh. I'll cut you off there. I should probably quickly say the book isn't really about a training book on how to become a compassion-focused therapist, nor is it a self-help book. The book is really about trying to unpack what we mean by compassion, although there are a couple of chapters where I do focus very much on mental health and do take you through a couple of little exercises, but they're very minor within the book, just to clear that up.
No, thank you. And look, I appreciate that space. I think there's value in all types of books, but that space is certainly one that I lean into a whole lot more. I find that understanding something from a philosophical level is much stickier and tends to integrate and has much more application in my mind than trying to become a therapist. I think you are a human first, and by understanding these things, and obviously with our training helps as to how to apply them. But the understanding is and the nuances around it. Hence, today's conversation is so important. The question that I asked just a moment ago is, where online can people find it? Is there a specific place, or it's fairly broad as well?
Yeah, no. You could look at Booktopia, Amazon, Book Depository. All of those places will have them. You can go to the publisher's website too, which is uqp.com.au, I want to say.
No, I'm sure we'll be able to find it. Now, you're also obviously senior lecturer in clinical psychology at UQ. Do you guys have places? Let's give them a quick plug while we're there, because I think I've interviewed a fair of your colleagues as well, doing great work out there.
I've noticed on your podcast, Matt Sanders, Alan Pegner, and the like. There's some terrific. Feel very lucky actually, being able to talk to these experts and get their ideas. Oh, it's ridiculous.
No, lovely. Thank you so much. How can people get in touch if they did want to find out more through the School of Psychology?
Yeah, absolutely. If type my name into Google, James Kirby, it should pop up. Type in School of Psychology if they wanted. I'm on Twitter too, although Twitter seems to be a funny world at the moment. I'm on Twitter at James N. Kirby, and I tweet all the time and tweet lots of different things, all connected to compassion. So they can message me on there too, but very easy to find.
Brilliant. James, thank you so much. I really do appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you, and I appreciate you as well for taking the time and giving us a good 101. I'll be definitely picking up a copy of your book as well. It's something that I think deserves a lot of attention to read and then chew over. There's so much complexity. I know that we've only just very briefly scratched the surface. There's so much more in there, so I'm eager to get my hands on a copy. And thank you so much for your time today.
Oh no, thank you very much. It was awesome.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.